Hello again. We have yet another installation of the nervous system. So this is where we left off last time, and that is at the pons. So basically, the pons is that part of the brainstem that serves as the bridge, and it's got ascending and descending myelinated fiber tracts. And so these relay impulses from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum that's related to voluntary skeletal movements. So that's why the pons sort of serves as a bridge. It's taking it from that one big portion of the brain of your cerebrum and carrying it over to your cerebellum for voluntary skeletal movements. So pneumotaxic and apneustic areas of the pons help control breathing pattern along with the medulla oblongata. So there are some parts of the brain that work on similar functions at the same time. So that kind of helps for like troubleshooting. If something were to ever go wrong in one area, it could potentially be solved in another. So again, you've got pneumotaxic and apneustic areas of the pons that help control breathing pattern along with the medulla oblongata. Then you have the middle cerebellar peduncles, and so this is where sensory information to the cerebellum goes. And so you can see in this image sitting right here along your brainstem, that's where the pons is. So you can see that it's in a nice location in order to be able to send information from the cerebrum to the cerebellum, like it kind of could travel through there. So what are the cranial nerves that are centered in the pons? You have cranial nerve 5, 6, and 7. So take note of where they're located. But again, this is cranial nerve 5, cranial nerve 6, cranial nerve 7. The nuclei for cranial nerves 5 through 8 are present here, but it's only the vestibular branch of number 8. So again, the cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens, and cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. So now we'll get to talk about those a little bit further. So cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, this is a mixed nerve. And if you'll remember from our last presentation, that means that it carries sensory and motor innervations within it. It's also called the three twins because it has 3 branches that come off of it. So aka tri, right? So trigeminal nerve has 3 branches that come off of it. The first is the ophthalmic nerve. So this has sensory information from the skin of the upper eyelid, from the eyeball, the lacrimal glands, the nasal cavity side of the nose, the forehead, and the anterior half of the scalp. And so this all passes through the superior orbital fissure that's present in your skull. So it's one of those little holes that's present within the skull, in the actual bones, that allows the nerve to pass through. So again, that's your ophthalmic nerve, and it's got sensory information from all of these areas. So like if something touches one of those things externally or whatever, it can carry that information back to the brain. Then you have the maxillary nerve, which has sensory information from the nose, the palate, parts of the pharynx, upper teeth, upper lip, and lower eyelid. And this is going to pass through the foramen rotundum as far as its geography within the skull. And then you have the mandibular. The mandibular nerve has sensory information except for taste that comes from the tongue, lower teeth, the skin over the mandible and cheek, and the side of the head. But as far as motor innervation goes, the trigeminal nerve has a motor portion in the mandibular nerve. And so this innervates the muscles of mastication. So your muscles of mastication are the ones in your face that help you chew. And so that's where those are. And these pass through the foramen ovale. And so just for like clinical application, neuralgia of branches is ticadural. And so this damage can cause paralysis of the muscles of mastication. Anesthesia by dentists of maxillary and mandibular branches. So they're essentially manipulating this process. So like when you go to the dentist and they have to numb your mouth for certain procedures, or even like veterinarians, as they might put in numbing agents for particular things that they're doing in animals' mouths, they are causing anesthesia and removing the sensory information from those muscles of mastication, and that's coming from the mandibular nerve. So you can do a nerve block in that area in order to stop sensation that's coming from there. And so again, this is just where cranial nerve 5 is located, the trigeminal nerve. So you can see those 3 branches right there. Those are the 3 branches that you're going to talk about. So the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. Now we have cranial nerve 6, which is the abducens. So again, this is a mixed nerve, meaning it's got motor and sensory innervations, and it passes through the superior orbital fissure. It's got sensory information as proprioceptors for the lateral rectus muscle. So remember, proprioception is like that kind of orientation and balance aspect. So as far as sensory information goes, it can kind of sense the orientation specifically of the lateral rectus muscle, and that's going to be one of the muscles that's in your in the eye. So it helps for eye positioning. It's also the motor innervation for the lateral rectus muscle. So in order to have that movement occur, this nerve will be innervated. If damaged, the affected eyeball cannot move laterally and the eye directs medially. So there will be cases where people will talk about that. If there's damage to the lateral rectus, that innervation is gone. So instead, like since there's no muscular contraction to keep it balanced, that eye will be directed medially and won't be able to go laterally. So that eye is going to look kind of lazy and kind of cross-eyed, focusing more central. And there it is. There's cranial nerve 6, the abducens. And then you got cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. So again, this is another mixed nerve, and it passes through the stylomastoid foramen on the skull. And it's got sensory innervations for taste on the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So the front 2/3 of the tongue is where this one will have sensory information for. And then it also is proprioceptors in the muscles of the face and the scalp. So that proprioception for the face and the scalp muscles that are there. And then it's motor for facial, scalp, and neck muscles. And it's parasympathetic innervation to the salivary glands. If damaged, Bell's palsy can occur, and that's paralysis of the face muscles. So that's where you kind of see that slack appearance that may be occurring. But also a loss of taste can occur. So it'd specifically be a loss of taste of the front 2/3 of the tongue, whatever senses. Well, I forget if it, with people, there are certain areas of your tongue that taste certain kinds of sensation. So whether that's like salty food or sour or sweet, whatever is in that front 2/3 of the tongue, if the facial nerve is damaged, you won't be able to sense that. This also causes decreased salivation because remember it's got parasympathetic innervation to the salivary glands. So if that nerve is damaged, it's not going to have an effect on the salivary glands, so they won't be able to secrete their substance, and so there will be less saliva produced. And there's also a loss of ability to close the eyes. Because remember, it's involving some of these facial muscles. So whatever help those muscles need in order to open and close the eyelids, it wouldn't be able to occur. And here it is in this image. That is cranial nerve 7, your facial nerve. All right, so now we've got the midbrain cranial nerves, right? And these are cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4. So the nuclei of cranial nerve 3 and 4 are 3 through 5 are present here, but 5 will continue on. And so number 3 is the oculomotor, and number 4 is the trochlear nerve. So going with the oculomotor nerve, this is a mixed nerve again. Most of them will be, but this is a mixed nerve, and it passes through the superior orbital fissure. So it's got sensory information for proprioception in the extrinsic muscles of the eye. So again, that's kind of like the orientation of some of the muscles that allow the eye to move. And it's got motor innervation to the levator palpebra superioris for extrinsic eye muscles. And so levator palpebra superioris, that's going to be your muscles that's going to help elevate your eyelid. So when you see like palpebral, it's referring to the eyelids. So that's that muscle that helps lift that. And then 4 eye extrinsic muscles, and it also innervates the parasympathetic ciliary muscles of the eye and the circular muscles of the iris. So remember, your iris is that inner portion of the eye, helping with constriction constriction and contraction in order to dilate or close those pupils. So damage to this causes strabismus, which both eyes don't fix on the same object, so they're not able to really focus. Drooping of the upper lid, dilation of the pupil, loss of accommodation, and double vision, right? Because, if these muscles are supposed to be contracting the iris, they should be, those are the contraction muscles in order to make the pupil smaller. So if this nerve isn't working, it's going to be dilated. That pupil will be larger than it normally should be. And there it is. There's cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve. And the trochlear nerve is cranial nerve 4. This is a mixed nerve that passes through the superior orbital fissure as well. And it's sensory information for proprioception in the superior oblique muscle. And then motor information for that same muscle of the eyeball. So helping with like eye movement as well a little bit. But damage to this causes double vision and strabismus. And there it is. There's cranial nerve 4. So right now you have the brainstem, the reticular formation specifically. This is where scattered nuclei are in the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the membrane, and the midbrain, excuse me. So as far as sensory information goes, it contains the reticular activating system. And this is what awakens the cerebral cortex from sleep by allowing sensory signals to reach the cortex. So when you're sleeping, less sensory information is able to get to that portion of the brain in order to allow it to rest and repair and do like other like functions that will happen when you're asleep. But to wake it up, it allows that sensory information to start coming back in to stimulate the brain. It maintains consciousness because of sensory inputs such as sound, touch, movement, and like proprioception and vision. So working at those specific aspects of like sensation is essentially what makes you conscious, being aware of your surroundings and all of the dimensions that are senses. So that is what is supporting that part of the brain. As far as motor function goes, it helps maintain muscle tone. So they're not just lax all the time, like whatever ones need to appropriately be stimulated for like resting posture or whatever, this can help maintain that. Alrighty, and then you have the diencephalon, right? And that is this portion of the brain that's highlighted for you here. And so it contains these structures that are within it, but it's this specific region. The diencephalon surrounds the third ventricle. And so the superior aspect is the thalamus, and the inferior aspect is the hypothalamus. And so you can see that depicted here. So this is your thalamus that's up here. And this more cranial portion is going to be the thalamus. And then in this more caudal portion, there it is, your hypothalamus. Other parts that are included are the epithalamus and the subthalamus, and these are all like portions that are discussed, but not at particular length, but just know that they're there. So there's your subthalamus, and your epithalamus is on top. So speaking of your thalamus, there are left and right sides that are connected by an intermediate mass. So you see, like, you've got your left and right sides, and they're connected in the middle by an intermediate mass. And so your thalamus is going to relay, it serves as a relay station for information that's ascending up to the cortex. And so this is involved in crude perception of some sensations. So essentially it's just allowing the information in that it's like, oh, smell, like salty smell. I'm just using that as an example. It's just kind of rote information that something is happening that your brain is sensing before it can get refined somewhere else in the brain. This is also where emotions and memory and cognition all occur. So that sort of abstract aspect of behavior is all around in there as well. So as far as thalamic nuclei, like we said, it's serves relay for sensory information. And so that specific sensory information is auditory, visual, taste, and somatic sensations like bodily. It receives impulses from the cerebellum, And it also receives impulses from the basal nuclei. And again, it's involved with emotions, memory, and cognition. And so breaking down just the different parts of the brain, this image will help you get a better picture of like where it is and why it does those things. Now you have the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is one of the major regulators of homeostasis. This is going to be an organ that you'll talk about a lot between anatomy and physiology throughout like other classes that you'll take. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system and produces releasing factors that affect the pituitary gland. And so it produces hormones in order to do that. Those are the signals that it'll use to control the pituitary gland as well as the rest of the autonomic nervous system and different things like that. It's involved in the regulation of emotional and behavioral patterns. And so it also provides like that sensation and like stimulation for feeding, satiety. I mean, that word is hard for me to say, but satiety. And so essentially that's the sensation of like being full, being satisfied is how I think of it. So satiety and thirst centers. So telling your brain when it's time to eat, when it's time to drink, and when you're full and when you've had enough. It's also involved in body temperature regulation, circadian rhythms, and states of consciousness, as well as it monitors osmotic pressure. So the balance of like fluids and water specifically within the body, it's monitoring osmotic pressure. And so you can see it here. So you've got your thalamus present, then the epithalamus is like on top of technically there. And so the hypothalamus is underneath the thalamus. More about the hypothalamus. So it's got 4 regions. It's got the mammillary region, the tuberal region, the supraoptic region, and the preoptic region. You can see all of that labeled within this image in order to kind of get orientation of where it is present within the brain. And so there are more than a dozen nuclei that are within these regions that are able to serve as like nerve centers. The mammillary bodies relay olfactory reflexes. And then you've got the infundibulum, which suspends the pituitary, and it contracts in a subset of the circulatory system. Well, it serves as a subset of the circulatory system. And then you have the epithalamus. Present in the epithalamus is the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin during darkness and promotes sleepiness and sets the biological clock in conjunction with the hypothalamus. So this is going to be that kind of like relationship between those two things that helps with circadian rhythms. So the pineal gland is sort of what's sensing like the daylight or darkness around you and being able to secrete that melatonin to create sleepiness when it's appropriate. So that way you and animals can balance out when they're supposed to be awake and when they're supposed to be asleep. And then there's the habenular nuclei, that allows for like emotional responses to odors. So like, if you smell something really gross, you almost get kind of angry about it or disgusted, it's like, ew, and so that's kind of that emotional response to an odor, as well as like, some people smell warm cookies, and get happy or feel like at peace or whatever. So it's whatever kind of response that comes with odors that are sensed. And so that is it. A teeny tiny thing in there. It's very small, but it does a lot of important work within the body. And so that's especially important in animals, because they have their different hibernation cycles or breeding cycles and things like that. And they can only sense that by interpreting the amount of daylight and things surrounding them. Alrighty, so then we have the subthalamus, and this includes tracts that connect to motor areas of the cerebrum. The subthalamic nuclei function together with the red nucleus and the substantia nigra of the midbrain, as well as the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and cerebrum to control body movements. So these are smaller portions of the brain, but they're working in conjunction with a lot of different aspects of it in order to operate for body movement. So then you have circumventricular organs, or CVOs, and these are parts of the diencephalon, since that's what we've been discussing, but these are parts of the diencephalon that have no blood-brain barrier. So that's what, Yes, they don't have any contact with the blood-brain barrier, right? So they monitor chemical changes in the blood, and this includes parts of the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. So it helps with like coordinating homeostatic activities of the endocrine and nervous systems. And a probable site of HIV entry into the brain, since normally it could probably be protected through the blood-brain barrier, since it isn't present here, HIV might have a way to get into the brain from there. Then you have the cerebellum. You know, the cerebellum is the cute little the cute little part at the back. But some of the functions of the cerebellum: it compares intended movements and posture signaled by the cerebrum with actual movements and postures. So I kind of think of the cerebellum as a refining center. So the cerebrum is going to send down like like really crude information, like move arm, like it's just telling it like move the arm, like just do it or whatever. But the cerebellum's kind of like, oh, like how do you need to move the arm? Like if you're trying to reach up to something on a shelf, it makes that one smooth fluid motion for you to reach up and pull back, versus just like shooting it up in the air without any real purpose or fluidity in order to keep things balanced. And so speaking of balance, it provides that sense of equilibrium as well. So your movement and orientation within space is really important with that. And so that's why the cerebellum is big on equilibrium. So by refining those movements, it helps keep the general balance of the body. As far as anatomy goes, the cerebellum has two hemispheres with an intermediate vermis. And so each hemisphere has an anterior and a posterior lobe. There are also external folia, and then it's got an outer gray cortex and inner central nuclei. And inside, it's the white matter, that's the arbor vitae. And so there's your cerebellum, like we were saying, it's kind of the cute little bulb that's on the back of the brain behind the cerebrum. And there's a better image of it so you can see it labeled with all of its different parts. So these are the cerebellar peduncles. So looking at it from the underside, you see you've got the superior cerebellar peduncle, the middle one, and the inferior one. So the superior one has motor fibers from the midbrain to the cerebellum, like we said, where that sensory information is coming from. The middle one has sensory fibers from the cerebral cortex and the ganglia that are there, and transverse fibers between the left and right hemispheres. So not only does it communicate with the cerebrum, it communicates with the other half of the cerebellum. And then the inferior one takes sensory information from the spinal cord. Now we have the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. So that's that big part when you're looking at like human brains, is really kind of what people think of when they think brain, that big mass that's in the front. It too has right and left hemispheres, and these are connected internally by the corpus callosum, and externally they're separated by the longitudinal fissure. So when you're looking at a brain, essentially it's kind of like two fists that are together. This line up top that's separating the two hemispheres is the longitudinal fissure. But inside, when you pull it apart, there's kind of like a space that's right there. That's going to be your corpus callosum, where they're connected internally. So the gray matter is going to be on the outside again, so the outer cortex as well as the inner basal ganglia. The cortex contains convolutions or like gyri, and then shallow grooves in between that are sulci. And so deeper grooves are fissures. So when you think of a brain, all those wrinkles and stuff that are around it, those wrinkles have names, right? Because this is anatomy, everything has a name. So the raised part that are like the little mounds that are there, those are going to be your gyri. And then the grooves that are in between them are called the sulci. So I like to think of it like when you sulk, you're sad and you're kind of downtrodden or whatever, like, oh, woe is me. So that downward depression is a sulci because it's a depression in the lines of the brain. But there are some deeper ones that are there, and those are called fissures, and the fissures are what help you distinguish different areas of the cerebrum. The basal ganglia are buried within the white matter within the cerebrum. And so here's just a picture to better point that out. So like the raised portions are like one is a gyrus, so plural is a gyri, and these little indentations in between them are a sulcus, so plural is sulci, right? And so again, we've got your gray matter on the outside, which is the cortex, and then the white matter on the inside. And so here is separating, if this was in the middle, it would be your longitudinal fissure. So what are the lobes of the cerebrum? Remember, I was saying that there are deeper lines that are present on the cerebrum, and those are fissures, and those fissures help you distinguish different parts of it, and those different parts of the cerebrum are the lobes, right? So here are the different lobes, important for you to know, much like everything is, but this is something that is a very easy question. So you've got the frontal lobe, this is a big one up here, your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, your temporal lobe, and so you can see there are names for like the different distinctions in between them. So for the lines, those little depressions, those are the fissures that help you separate the different lobes, right? So from your frontal lobe to your parietal lobe, you've got this central sulcus. And then from the parietal lobe to the occipital lobe, you've got the parieto-occipital sulcus, things like that. So hopefully, the name matches up with the location or the function of it. But here you go, 4 lobes in each hemisphere that are visible externally and named after the bones that they're associated with. So again, those are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The sulci, like we said, divide the lobes from each other. So here's your central sulcus that divides the frontal from the parietal lobe. The lateral cerebral sulcus, which divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, but like on the side. The parieto-occipital sulcus, which divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And then you've got one lobe that's deep in the lateral surface of each hemisphere, and that's called the insula. That's that one that's right here. So it's not really on the outside. They're just showing you where it is, like within the inside. And this is your transverse fissure. It's not on this slide, but that's going to be your separation between like your cerebrum and your cerebellum. So, all right, white matter, right? White matter has these fiber tracts. And so the association fibers are what are between gyri in the same hemisphere, right? So the gyri that are on the same side of the brain kind of communicating amongst each other. But then you have commissural fibers, which connect gyri from one cerebral hemisphere to the corresponding gyri on the opposite cerebral hemisphere. So they go from like between the two sides of the brain. And remember, there's like that commissure that's in between. So that's why they're called commissural fibers, because they communicate through there. And then you have projection fibers that leave or enter. Those are forming the ascending sensory information or descending like motor information. And so it can communicate that from other parts of the brain to the spinal cord. And now you have the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia are paired masses of gray matter that are in each cerebral hemisphere, and they control large automatic movements of skeletal muscles. This connects to the red sulcus and the substantia nigra of the subthalamus. And it receives input and sends output from the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So that's like the big thing of what the basal ganglia is for. And so as far as parts of it go, so it's got a lentiform and caudate nucleus that are present within it. And so what happens when there's damage to the basal ganglia? Damage to the basal ganglia can cause tremors, rigidity, and involuntary muscle movements. So remember, it's doing a lot of communicating with some of the more sensitive parts of the brain. So damage to it ruins that refinement that's being worked on. So you can get tremors as well as rigidity and involuntary muscle movements, so like spasms. So when you think of that, so it's like Parkinson's disease, and that's when the neurons from the substantia nigra communicate with the putamen and the caudate nucleus. The ones that do that, they start to degenerate. So when you think of Parkinson's, it's a lot of uncontrolled muscle movements. You know, like people will sit here and they'll talk to you, but like won't be able to stop moving the whole time like that. And so that degeneration of those nerves and those nuclei, it's not sending the impulses correctly for those movements. So that's why you're getting those jerky, uncontrollable actions. Besides motor control, the basal ganglia can help initiate and terminate some cognitive processes, and so therefore damage to it can cause like OCD and schizophrenia and chronic anxiety. So it's thought to involve dysfunction of the limbic system as well. So lastly, we didn't finish with the cranial nerves. I know you were probably wondering about the last few, but we've been going with regions of the brain. But so going back, so we've got cranial nerve 1, and that's the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is going to be your sense of smell. So another word for like smell is olfaction. So that one's an easy one to remember. The olfactory nerve is involved with your sense of smell. It's got sensory information that goes through it. So it passes through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, and this extends from the olfactory mucosa of the nasal cavity to the olfactory bulb. So the olfactory mucosa that are present in the nose, it's got innervation from the olfactory nerve that extends from there all the way up to the olfactory bulb that is in the brain. And so that's the olfactory bulb is right here on the end, and the olfactory nerve is coming down, and this is the olfactory tract that information will run down. And then cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, which is involved with vision. So this is sensory information, and so these fibers are going to pass through the optic foramen. And so the optic nerve is composed of fibers that make up the retina within the eye. And so the fibers of the optic tract project to the visual cortex that's in the occipital lobe, and that's how you get sight. And so this is the optic nerve on the front end, and this is the optic tract where that information will get sent out. So here's an overview. I know we talked about that a lot between the last slides and this one, but an overview of the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So you've got sensory areas that receive and interpret sensory impulses, motor areas that govern muscular movement, beginning, and so that's the beginning of the descending fibers that send out information for those movements to occur. And then there are association areas that have integrated functions such as like memory, emotions, reasoning, will, judgment, personality, and intelligence. So that's where it takes honestly all that sensory information and can interpret it as well as like make lasting impressions about it and how to respond about it from a more like emotional perspective. The sensory areas are all of these. I know that looks like a lot, but it will get broken down for you. But like the sensory areas receive and interpret sensory impulses. So the primary somatosensory area is the postcentral gyrus, and the primary visual area is 17, which is right here, primary visual area. So it's got labels for you to see that. And then the primary auditory area is 41 and 42. So you'll notice that somewhat, not always exactly, but the areas that focus this sensory information are near the nerve tracts that allow for that information to be received. As far as the motor areas go, same image, different description. But remember again that it's governing muscular movement, and this is the beginning of descending fibers sending those movements out. So you've got the primary motor area, which is the precentral gyrus, and so that's controlling the voluntary contractions of skeletal muscles on the opposite side. So remember, the brain has these two hemispheres, but like the actions that are taking place with muscular movements correspond to the opposite side of the brain that's acting on the body. So like if I want to move my right arm up, the left side of my cerebrum is making that movement happen. And then you have the motor speech area, which is depicted by number 44. far as association areas go, same image, you love it. Integrative functions such as, like we said, memory, emotions, reasoning, will, judgment, personality, and intelligence. That goes to the somatosensory area as well, to integrate and interpret. So that's number 5 and number 7. The visual association area, so it recognizes and evaluates stimuli. So instead of just receiving that information in like sight, like in general, that's number 7. Recognizing and evaluating that information happens in 18 and 19. And the auditory association or Wernicke's area, it's involved with like speech patterns. That's available at 22. And the gnostic area, which integrates all senses to allow the body to respond to it. That's at number 5. The premotor area is where learned skill movements are around. So that one, as it gives the example of like playing piano. So, when you first learn how to play piano, you have to think about, those finger movements and every individual thing. But the more you practice, the more subconscious that kind of response comes. So that becomes a learned, skilled movement. And so that area that associates all of that is number 6. All right, so before we get into this, you've covered basically everything that's in the brain now. So we discussed all the cranial nerves. So remember, those cranial nerves, you have to know them in order and be able to find them on the brain. So cranial nerves 1 through 12. People often think of acronyms in order to help you remember corresponding which one those are. So I can give you one just because of the way the order of this PowerPoint is. I'm not going to say it like right now, but like if you have questions or want to do that, feel free to email me or ask about it on the little discussion board and I can post something there. But you have to know those cranial nerves 1 through 12 and exactly the numbers that go with them. You depict them with the Roman numerals and the names that go with them and what they do, right? You should also be familiar with the parts of the brain and what they correspond to and how like the nerves integrate within them. I mean, everything that we talked about is important, but it's good to start grouping that information so it's easier to remember and you can start to recall it and utilize for later in this class and other courses that you might take. So now that we talked about all the different parts of the brain, basically, we can talk about how to measure and interpret what's going on with it, right? So you can do that with an electroencephalogram or an EEG. And so this is a type of machine and like measurement process that evaluates brain waves. So brain waves are a summation of millions of nerve action potentials in the cerebral cortex. So it's kind of this great big conglomerate of action potentials in order to make things happen. So there are alpha brain waves that are present for like when you're awake and resting with your eyes closed. Beta brain waves that show for intense mental activity, and theta brain waves that are normal in children but aren't really found in adults. They're normal in children, but they're found in adults only during like emotional stress, frustration, and like brain disorders. And you have delta brain waves, which are involved with deep sleep, infancy, and brain disorders. And so this is how one would visualize them with an EEG. So like the alpha brain waves are, follow this particular pattern versus the beta brain waves that are a little more squished together than the alpha ones, and then the theta ones, which are more spread out than the two of them, and the delta ones, which are even more spread out than all of them. So what are these machines used for? People use them in order to diagnose epilepsy and other seizure disorders, infectious diseases, tumors, trauma, hematomas, metabolic abnormalities, degenerative diseases, confusions, and periods of unconsciousness. So it's basically evaluating the brain waves in order to interpret some of the things that are going on within it. It's also available to be used for information regarding sleep and wakefulness, and determination of brain death. So like in hospital situations where they're trying to evaluate, vitals and if this patient is alive, people use, brain waves in order to see if it's sending out signals or anything to determine like if a patient is brain dead. So brain function summary, kind of wrapping everything up. This is a really good image to remember. I would tell you to kind of hold on to this slide and read through it for your studying. I'm not going to read through all of these for you. You're more than capable of doing that. But it breaks down, the region of the brain and what it's involved with and the cranial nerves that are present there. So this is a good one to use. And then this is continued here so you can see it breaks down the cranial nerves for you. So that's, the last slide was number 1. There's number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, number 10, 11, and 12. So again, I'm not going to go through those for you because, you can read them. But it gives a lot of good information for you to study these cranial nerves off and a little more descriptive than what we could just talk about in the slides. Oof. So now we finished with that great big endeavor. And now we're on to the autonomic nervous system. So what are the divisions of the nervous system that we'll talk about again, just to help reorient you? So you've got the central nervous system, right, which is your brain and your spinal cord. And then your peripheral nervous system, that is where cranial and spinal nerves that contain both sensory and motor fibers. So basically, it's all of the nerves that are not directly in it. The peripheral nervous system is your nerves, so your central nervous system is made up specifically of your brain and your spinal cord and what's immediately attached to that. But the peripheral nervous system are the cranial and spinal nerves that come off of it and are bringing in both sensory and motor fibers. And so this peripheral nervous system connects the CNS to muscles, glands, and all sensory receptors.